the first in the Accessible Ohio Playbook 6-part webinar series. My name is Brianna Potter, and I am an occupational therapist and the Accessible Ohio Specialist for the Northeast area of the state. Presenting alongside me today is my colleague, Julia. Would you like to introduce yourself and explain the accessibility features of today's webinar?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Wagner, and I am the Southwest Accessible Ohio Specialist, and I'm also an occupational therapist. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text, known as alt text, to visual images. Also, in our delivery, we mention each other by name as the conversation goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone. Brianna, can you give the attendees an overview of our webinar series?
Absolutely. The Accessible Ohio Playbook 6-part webinar series starts with today's session, The Fundamentals. In this session, we will share information about the Accessible Ohio Initiative and how we can be a resource to Ohio's businesses, communities, venues, attractions, and employers through the services we offer. We will describe 3 main fundamentals to consider when designing and enhancing the accessibility and inclusion of all environments. These include the Accessible Ohio Priorities, the Americans with Disabilities Act, known as the ADA, and universal design. Throughout the webinar, we will provide examples and demonstrate how Accessible Ohio can connect our partners with best practices for accessibility and inclusivity. The next 4 webinars in the series will each highlight one of Accessible Ohio's priorities: planning and awareness, navigation, experience, and personal care. They will provide an overview of the priority, give ideas for accessibility features and universal design concepts, and share how Accessible Ohio can be a resource through consultations, education, and resources. Our last session is called The Game Plan and will address how to establish and prioritize goals for accessibility and inclusion, and then create a plan for achieving these goals. Julia, let's get things started with our first activity.
Great idea. As part of the webinar registration, we invited attendees to voluntarily share if they know someone who has a disability, and if so, identify their relationship with this person. The word cloud graphic we are displaying on the PowerPoint slide is a representation of the responses we received. Individuals with disabilities are our coworker, our uncle, our daughter, our aunt, ourselves, a grandparent, a friend, a sister, our mother, a neighbor, our brother, and our son. What these words convey is that disability is a part of everyone's lives, and it matters to all of us that our surroundings are accessible and inclusive. When they are not, it creates a barrier to participating in meaningful activities. The Accessible Ohio Initiative is designed to promote accessibility so everyone can experience Ohio in an equitable way. Brianna, will you introduce Accessible Ohio and how it can be a resource?
Sure. Accessible Ohio is an initiative made possible through Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor John Huston's operating budget for state fiscal years 2024 and 2025. Governor DeWine and his wife Fran are included in the image on the PowerPoint slide. The Accessible Ohio team of 4 regional specialists and an Accessible Ohio manager partner with employers, businesses, communities, venues, and attractions to help identify barriers, establish goals for accessibility, connect them with resources for accessibility enhancements, and provide information about potential funding sources. Our team's mission is to prioritize accessibility from the start, promote inclusiveness, and ensure everyone can experience Ohio in an equitable way. We strive to move beyond the minimum guidelines of the ADA and focus on universal design, both of which are addressed throughout this webinar series. To explain how Accessible Ohio can help your organization, I'd like to share the services provided by the Accessible Ohio specialists. These include consultations, education, and resource guides. Through a consultation, an Accessible Ohio specialist will work one-on-one with an organization to learn about their accessibility goals and provide resources and information on best practices related to accessibility, inclusivity, and universal design. We also partner with employers who have specific goals and projects related to accessibility, disability inclusion, and responsibilities under Title I of the ADA to provide reasonable accommodations for employees and candidates with disabilities. These consultations include sharing information about grants and funding sources available for partners to consider when making accessibility enhancements that might be more costly. Accessible Ohio specialists also provide education through in-person presentations and monthly webinars. Our monthly webinars are recorded and archived in our on-demand library so that they can be accessed at any time. We also develop helpful resource guides with information on a variety of topics to reference and become more aware of accessibility concepts and practices. These are organized and simple to find on the Accessible Ohio webpage.
Brianna, because accessibility touches everything we do, we like to describe it as a journey we are all on. To help Accessible Ohio partners prioritize where to start and plan their next steps, we've organized accessibility into 3 main fundamentals, which begin with our Accessible Ohio priorities and then continue with guidance from the ADA, and to a larger extent, the concepts included with universal design. Next, we will discuss the Accessible Ohio priorities, which include planning and awareness, navigation, experience, and personal care. Let's kick things off with the first priority. The first priority is planning and awareness. This includes the activities a person may participate in when learning about or planning a visit. It also involves the ways entities plan for accessibility and inclusion. I'll share some examples. Websites can include an accessibility page that describes the accessibility features the entity offers and includes a statement about how to request an accommodation. Some ideas of accessibility features to mention include information about accessible parking, assistive listening devices available, and the location of a sensory room. Another example includes training staff on disability awareness and etiquette to support respectful interactions with customers with disabilities and how to assist with the accessibility features the venue offers. One last idea is provide a social narrative or story on the website as a planning tool for individuals. These display pictures and descriptions of social situations and activities like purchasing a ticket and offer appropriate responses to these situations when visiting the venue. Brianna, can you share an example of a consultation we provided for the planning and awareness priority area?
Sure. We consulted with an outdoor recreational facility who had questions about making their website accessible for visitors, as well as how to ensure all areas in their venue could be accessed. We provided several resources to support these goals. The first was the Department of Justice, known as the DOJ, titled Guidance on Web Accessibility and the ADA. This resource provides information on how state and local governments and public businesses are required to make their websites accessible. We also shared resources for technical standards for website accessibility, which include the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, known as WCAG, and the Section 508 standards. Additionally, we shared the best practice of incorporating an accessibility page. This is a designated page on an entity's website that describes the accessibility features of their venue and enables individuals to access information to support their individual needs when planning a visit. Our consult provided ideas and information about this best practice, such as including a statement about the entity's commitment to accessibility and inclusion, providing contact information for individuals to use if they encounter barriers or need to request an accommodation, and including a comprehensive list of the features at the venue, such as accessible parking, restrooms, interpreting services, and more. For the partner's goal of ensuring all areas of their venue were accessible to visitors, the Accessible Ohio Specialist shared a resource from the New England ADA Center called the ADA Checklist for Existing Facilities. This checklist assists entities with assessing the built environment and planning their goals for becoming inclusive for everyone. Julia, what is the second priority area?
The second priority to consider is navigation. Navigation involves the steps individuals take to arrive, enter, and navigate an environment. Here are some examples. Accessible signage helps all visitors navigate a space and find what they're looking for. Some best practices include considering the color contrast of the text and background, using plain language, and including pictures and symbols. Entities can also implement accessibility maps as a tool for individuals to be aware of the accessibility features of the environment and find what they need. And providing motorized wheelchair and scooter charging stations can enable individuals who utilize these to recharge their device and stay in an attraction as long as they wish. Brianna, can you share an example of an Accessible Ohio consultation that addressed this priority area?
Sure. Accessible Ohio has consulted with a local county who is renovating a public building to serve as a space for several community services. They had questions related to accessible parking, passenger loading and unloading zones, accessible interior and exterior routes, as well as several other enhancements. The Accessible Ohio Specialist provided the county with resources and best practices for their goals. One resource is the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design, which we refer to as the standards. This guidance was created by the DOJ to provide the minimum guidelines for entities with responsibilities under Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA that are designing, constructing, or altering their environment for public use. The specific guidance shared in this consult addressed the number, location, dimensions, and signage for parking spaces, the technical requirements for passenger loading zones, and guidance on accessible routes, including where they are required, floor and ground surfaces, inclines, and accessible egress. Next up is the priority area of experience. Julia, what are some examples of this priority?
Experience includes what individuals are at the venue or attraction to do or enjoy. There are many examples of ways to make an experience more accessible. One idea is to implement tools to become sensory friendly. Examples include hosting sensory friendly hours where lights are dimmed and noise volumes are decreased. Entities can also consider enhancing accessibility for presentations, meetings, and performances by providing live captioning to create a more inclusive experience. Physical accessibility of the environment should also be considered to ensure everyone can experience the attraction, event, or workplace equitably. For example, a beach can incorporate a temporary pathway to create a level surface, which enables individuals using mobility aids and families using strollers to access the area. Brianna, can you share an example of an Accessible Ohio consultation that addressed this priority area?
Yes. In a consultation with a public museum, we provided resources and best practices related to universal design and their responsibilities under Title II of the ADA. One resource was the 2010 ADA standards we mentioned in a previous example. Another resource we use to provide information is the United States Access Board's Guide to the ADA Accessibility Standards. This guide illustrates some of the common guidelines found in the standards with helpful pictures and videos. One way we've used these resources is to share the guidance related to signage to help the partner create and modify signage related to their exhibits. These standards and the guide to the standards include information on sign installation height and location, finish and contrast, and providing visual and tactile or raised characters. We also included a resource with ideas for universal design. This includes best practices for providing visual, tactile, and audio forms of communication. For example, an art piece can have a sign describing the history of the piece using text and raised characters, along with the option to hear this information from an audio recording. This creates an experience that is perceptible and understandable to individuals with various disabilities, learning styles, and ages. Julia, what is the last priority area?
Our last priority is personal care. This priority encompasses the personal needs all individuals have when in communities and public areas. Public restrooms can be made accessible through a variety of strategies. One way is to include universal changing stations and accessible family restrooms to support the ability for individuals to utilize a private space to manage their personal needs, regardless of size, age, and ability. Another aspect of personal care is individuals' unique sensory needs. For example, sensory rooms and areas can be implemented throughout environments as a resource for individuals to use when feeling over or underwhelmed by sounds, sights, and smells in the environment. Brianna, can you share an example of an Accessible Ohio consultation that addressed this priority area?
Sure. Many of our consults have included entities inquiring about the use of service animals in their environments. Through these consults, we provide information taken from the DOJ's ADA Requirements Service Animals resource. This includes the guidance for Title II and Title III entities to permit service animals in all areas where members of the public are allowed to go. It also includes how the ADA defines a service animal, what questions entities are permitted to ask individuals requesting this reasonable modification, and other specific rules. We also educate entities covered under Titles II and III of the ADA on their responsibility to provide reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures as set by the DOJ. This can include a public college modifying their No Animals Allowed policy to permit the use of service animals in the classroom as a reasonable modification. A best practice that goes beyond the minimum guidelines set by the ADA and is also shared with partners is the implementation of a service animal relief area. These areas offer a safe space designated for service animals to tend to their personal needs. All right, that is a high-level overview of the Accessible Ohio priorities we use to organize consultations, develop education, inform the creation of resources, and to guide our conversations with partners about disability inclusion. The other two fundamentals we rely on are the ADA and universal design. Julia, would you like to start with the ADA?
Absolutely. The ADA is a civil rights law that makes it unlawful to discriminate against individuals with disabilities in all facets of public life. Pictured in the PowerPoint is President George H.W. Bush signing the ADA into law, surrounded by 4 individuals. The ADA includes 5 titles which address access to work, school, transportation, and public places. Title I of the ADA makes it unlawful to discriminate against individuals with disabilities in all aspects of employment and requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities when needed. Title II prohibits discrimination based on disability in programs, services, and activities offered to the public by state and local governments. Some examples of covered entities include places of public education, public transportation, and libraries. Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination based on disability in commercial facilities and places of public accommodation. Some examples of covered entities include businesses and nonprofit organizations, such as restaurants, movie theaters, and recreational facilities. Title IV of the ADA addresses access to telecommunications and television and requires common carriers such as telephone companies to establish a nationwide system of telecommunications relay services. Title V of the ADA contains miscellaneous provisions which apply broadly across all the ADA titles and includes things like how the ADA relates to other laws. In addition to supporting our partners with their questions about the ADA, we also consult on ideas for universal design as a way to foster more inclusive environments. Brianna, before we introduce the concept of universal design, I'd like to open it up to questions the audience may have. The entire Accessible Ohio team is here with us today, and Julie Wood, the Accessible Ohio manager, will be joining us for the question and answer portions of this webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. Also, we did receive some pre-submitted questions during the registration process for today's webinar. Brianna, while we're waiting for questions in the chat, will you share a pre-submitted question?
Sure. Somebody pre-submitted that they would love to hear about accessibility in promoting or marketing social services to people through websites, print materials, and more. And thank you for that question. We would love to partner with you on your accessibility goals. So if you would like to partner with us, please contact the Accessible Ohio specialist in your region, and you can find our contact information on our webpage. We would then set up a call with you and your team to better understand your goals and assist you in reaching those goals. All of our services are available at no cost, and this includes our one-on-one consultations where we can have a conversation to better understand your goals and provide resources such as the web content accessibility guidelines we addressed earlier, as well as best practices to create accessible web pages, social media, and digital materials. We can also connect you to the Accessible Ohio resource guides on specific accessibility topics, such as website accessibility. And lastly, we offer in-person presentations and monthly webinars that address these same topics. Julia, did you have another pre-submitted question you'd like to answer?
Yes. The second pre-submitted question is, does the ADA apply to nonprofit organizations? That's a great question. The DOJ, or Department of Justice, provides guidance on entities that are covered under Title III of the ADA. Examples of covered entities are businesses, including nonprofits, that serve the public. Some examples are gyms, factories, privately owned transit, movie theaters, and shops. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, provides guidance on who is considered a covered entity with responsibilities under Title I of the ADA, which is the employment title. This guidance defines covered entities as private employers, state and local governments, employment agencies, labor unions, and joint labor management committees with 15 or more employees. We'd be happy to share this guidance with you if that is helpful. Just reach out to one of us.
Thanks, Julia. And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat as of right now, but thank you for those pre-submitted questions. We will be stopping one more time at the end of this webinar for another question and answer session. So let's continue by introducing our next fundamental, the concept of universal design. Universal design is focused on moving beyond the minimum guidelines to create an environment that can be accessed by all. This is also the mission of Accessible Ohio. This is a fundamental we are going to spend a bit more time on in today's webinar. The term universal design was originally coined by Ronald Mace, who was an architect. Ronald contracted polio as a child and utilized a wheelchair. He introduced a new concept for design that prioritized creating spaces and objects to be understandable, usable, and accessible to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, disability, or other factors. Professionals from different specialties collaborated to establish these 7 principles of universal design. These principles have guided the creation of inclusive environments, products, and structures. Later, the 8 goals of universal design were created to further support these principles. We will discuss these with examples, but first, Julia, we want to do some myth busting.
That's right. There are some misconceptions about universal design that we'd like to address. To debunk these, I will provide the myth, and Brianna, you can provide the fact. The first myth is universal design is only meant to benefit individuals who use wheelchairs.
Well, Julia, the concept of universal design is intended to benefit all people in addition to individuals who utilize wheelchairs. Here is an example. Curb cuts in a sidewalk provide a graded entry to an elevated surface. This can benefit a variety of individuals to transition from a parking lot to a building entrance. Some examples include those who use mobility devices like wheelchairs, scooters, or walkers, families with strollers, and individuals riding bicycles.
That is a good point, Brianna. Another myth is universal design is not aesthetically pleasing for businesses who value interior design. Do you have any information to share on this?
Sure, Julia. Universal design can complement interior design while also making a space accessible and inclusive. The PowerPoint slide displays a picture of an open concept floor plan, which enables individuals to freely navigate the environment. The contrasting colors between the red spiraled ramp and gray flooring provide clear identification of the intended pathway. These design choices create an environment that is aesthetically pleasing and welcoming to all. Julia, do you have another myth to share?
I do. Many people think that universal design is costly to implement. This can deter business owners from considering universal design during new building construction and/or when remodeling.
Julia, the General Services Administration reports that universal design costs less in the long term because individuals' needs are addressed from the start. Also, sometimes implementing universal design concepts costs nothing at all, like when furniture is being rearranged for communication and mobility needs. In other words, implementing universal design does not have to be costly.
That's a good point, Brianna. I've got another idea to share. Businesses think they need a lot of space if they want to incorporate universal design. Is this true?
No, Julia, this is a misconception, and we have a picture to demonstrate that universal design does not necessarily mean you need a lot of space. The picture displayed on the PowerPoint slide is a round desk with varying counter heights. This enables the employee to choose the height that works best for them when they interact with customers. The picture also displays a cutout located below the desk. The cutout provides clearance for customers using wheelchairs and enables them to approach the desk and interact with the employee in a natural manner. Not only does this desk follow best practices for inclusivity, it also takes up the same or less space than a traditional shaped desk would.
And Brianna, I also noticed the counter space on the desk has not been compromised as a result of the cutout. Our last myth relates to the idea that current building regulations and standards meet the best practices of universal design.
Julia, the ADA standards set the minimum guidelines to make environments accessible and usable to individuals with disabilities. Universal design is focused on moving beyond these minimum guidelines and considering the needs of all people when creating environments and products such as the aging population, families and children, various learning styles, and individuals with disabilities. Both designs highlight the importance of inclusion and accessibility. Now that we have set the record straight, let's discuss the 7 principles of universal design. The first principle is equitable use. This means the design is usable by all. For example, automatic doors enable a parent pushing a child in a stroller, a shopper with their arms full of bags, and an individual using a mobility device to enter or exit a grocery store. Next is the principle of flexibility in use. This principle reminds us to keep the unique characteristics of individuals in mind. One idea is an adjustable workstation, which enables an employee to customize their work environment to their needs, which may include alternating between sitting and standing to manage low back pain. The third principle is simple and intuitive use. This considers the various ways people process information, such as through vision, sound, or touch, to understand and use a product or space. This can include making sure signage at places like airports includes visual images, audio descriptions, and written text. Julia, what are some of the other principles of universal design?
The fourth principle is perceptible information. This means the information being communicated can be received regardless of the ability to see, hear, touch, taste, or smell. For example, an exhibit at the zoo provides the same information through a written sign and an audio recording. The next principle of universal design is tolerance for error. This considers safety when a person is using a product or moving about an environment. An example of this is a retail store ensuring their aisles are free from product displays and clutter that protrude into the required space for navigating the area. The sixth principle is low physical effort. This focuses on a person's comfort, strength, and endurance when utilizing a product or interacting with an environment. An example is to locate benches throughout a hiking trail for individuals to use to rest, take a break to drink water, or tie their shoes. The last principle of universal design is size and space for approach and use. What this means is consideration should be taken when designing a space to ensure individuals can navigate and use all aspects of the environment regardless of their body size, shape, or ability to move. One example is a gym offering drinking fountains at various heights. These 7 principles provide some great ideas to consider when designing or modifying an object or space. Since the development of these in 1997, there have been new ideas for the concept of universal design. Brianna, can you tell us more about this?
I would be happy to. The 8 goals of universal design were created by Edward Steinfeld and Jordana Maisel at the University at Buffalo's Center for Inclusive Design and Environmental Access to apply the principles of universal design in a measurable and comprehensive way. The goals consider culture, individual ability, and socialization, which, when considered as a whole, contributes to the overall health and well-being of everyone. Multiple perspectives were considered, such as safety, biomechanics, and perception during their creation. The first goal of universal design is body fit. This considers the uniqueness of how each person moves and their body size and shape. Here's an example. One way an airport can implement body fit is to provide various size seating options with removable armrests. Next is the goal of comfort. This considers how a space or product can be designed to support an individual's ability to navigate or use the space or product. For example, hotels can consider installing grab bars and benches in walk-in showers to accommodate the needs of all individuals. Awareness is the next goal of universal design and establishes the importance of making sure information can be noticed and recognized without difficulty. For example, restaurants can use the universal symbols to indicate men, women, and family restrooms. These symbols are generally recognized by all people despite cognition or communication ability. Julia, what are the other goals of universal design?
The 4th goal is understanding. This means the design is clear, concise, and user-friendly for all. For example, to assist college students with navigating the campus, the college could consider implementing strategies that use sight, sound, and touch. In addition to accessible signage, one idea is to provide a visual interpreter through an app on a smartphone to assist a blind student with navigating between buildings. The goal of wellness reminds us to make sure individuals are protected from risks and disease while promoting their overall health and well-being. For example, a local library incorporates natural lighting throughout their building and designs an open space where furniture is configured to encourage socialization amongst visitors, which supports individuals feeling connected. Next is social integration. This highlights the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their age, ability, culture, or other factors. For example, a park ranger makes eye contact with the deaf individual he is providing information to about a trail instead of the sign language interpreter who is present and interpreting. The 7th goal is personalization and prioritizes autonomy, which means individuals can independently make a choice that fits their needs. For example, a bowling alley designs their website to enable individuals to decide if they want to navigate their site using a computer mouse or a keyboard. Lastly is cultural appropriateness. This goal reminds us that we have unique cultural norms, values, and beliefs. This is important to consider in all circumstances when creating or modifying a building, product, or environment. An example of cultural appropriateness is to offer written content in various languages. Another example is implementing translator services as a best practice to ensure information is received by all. Well, that summarizes the 7 principles and 8 goals of universal design. Now, let's compare the concepts of universal design with accessible design. Brianna?
The concept of accessible design is informed by the ADA Civil Rights Law and the 2010 Standards for Accessible Design provided by the DOJ. Accessibility focuses on removing barriers and providing access to individuals with disabilities. Universal design considers equal access for all people, including the aging population, children and families, various learning styles, and individuals with disabilities. It is informed by the principles and goals we described earlier. Accessible design and universal design work together to remove barriers and provide access for all. An example of accessible design is installing light switches 42 inches from the ground without obstruction. This may meet the requirements in the standards. Let's think about an individual who has a limitation with raising their arms or a young child. The height of the light switch could present a barrier for both individuals. An inclusive design with a universal design approach includes installing automatic light switches. This feature eliminates the need to physically manipulate an object to turn on the light. Instead, an individual can enter a room and the lights will turn on when it senses motion. Julia, that's an example that can be implemented as a modification or during a renovation. Can you provide a no-cost example?
Sure, Brianna. An example of a no-cost accessibility feature is to provide contact information on a website for individuals to use to obtain information about a venue's accessibility features. While this is a good practice, a universal design approach includes creating a web page dedicated to describing the venue's accessibility features. Some venues incorporate this in the About Your Visit section of their website and include the statement about who to contact with questions as well. This can be helpful for individuals when planning their visit by offering a quick way to identify the accessibility features available. Both ideas can be enhanced by including an accommodation statement with contact information. This communicates to all individuals that the entity cares about what individuals with disabilities need and provides information to request an accommodation. For example, an individual may need sign language interpretation to experience a museum tour. An accommodation statement informs the individual of who to contact. Brianna, can you share one last example?
Another example of accessible design is providing the minimum number of accessible entrances at a venue or attraction. At times, this may mean the accessible entrance is a separate entrance with a ramp at the side of the building when the main entrance is accessed by a set of stairs. However, if a universal design approach was applied, all entrances could be designed to be graded, easily navigated, and accessible so everyone could use the same entrances, including individuals with disabilities, families with children, the aging population, and more. Julia, how about we provide our audience with an opportunity to apply these concepts?
What a great idea. We are going to share a series of strategies one at a time. Please select which category you believe the strategy falls into, accessible design or universal design. Okay, the first strategy is having a drinking fountain, which operates by a touchless motion sensor. Is this an example of accessible design or universal design? Please select the category you believe this fits in. All right, it looks like the majority of our audience selected the universal design category. Thank you for answering. Brianna, what's the correct answer?
The correct answer is universal design. A touchless motion sensor drinking fountain removes the need for individuals to use physical effort to activate it. This incorporates the universal design concepts of low physical effort and comfort. These standards, which provides guidance on accessible design, addresses the maximum efforts permitted to twist, turn, or pull a handle to activate a drinking fountain. Julia, how about another one?
Sure. Here's the next strategy. A local bank provides signage next to an ATM, which includes pictures of an individual following the step-by-step instructions to withdraw money from the ATM. Would this strategy be an example of accessible design or universal design? Please select the category. Got some responses going in. This one's a little bit, oh, it's moving. Okay, it looks like the majority of our audience selected the accessible design category. Thanks again for your answers.
Julia, the answer for this strategy is universal design. Individuals may not be familiar with the process of withdrawing money from an ATM, or they may have a limitation with reading English. A visual support can support diverse needs and uses the concepts of perceptible information and understanding from universal design.
Thanks, Brianna. I've got one more strategy to share with our audience. How about having signage that includes both visual and raised characters to identify exits? Would this be an example of accessible design or universal design? Thank you for your responses. It looks like the majority of our audience felt that this fell into the accessible design category.
Julia, the correct answer for this strategy is accessible design. Providing signage with visual and tactile or raised characters as required by the standards is an example of accessible design. In addition to this, providing audio beacons at entrances and exits, which play recorded sounds and messages along with visual and raised characters, is a strategy that can enable all individuals to navigate the environment independently. This universal design concept considers equitable use and understanding. All of these examples are ideas that we provide in our consultations to partners. That wraps up the fundamentals. Let's apply the content of today's webinar by giving examples of accessibility features that fall under each Accessible Ohio priority. We will then ask the audience to share what best practices they have learned about, implemented, or experienced. We are going to provide an example of an accessibility feature that corresponds to one of the 4 Accessible Ohio priorities and ask you to share your own example. You can share your examples by typing them into the chat. Our first accessibility feature is Service Animal Relief Areas, which is an example of the priority area personal care. Having service animal relief areas available at a venue can be an inclusive practice for individuals who use a service animal. This promotes the individual's ability to access what a business or attraction has to offer. What are some other examples of accessibility features that support personal care? You can go ahead and type your examples into the chat.
Brianna, we have somebody that mentioned an accessible ramp and a door entrance.
That is a best practice. I think it could go into personal care, and it could also go into another accessible high priority, which would be navigation.
And we have a few that have said universal changing stations. That is a great practice. We've also recommended this to partners. Yeah, universal changing stations. We've gotten quite a few. And sensory rooms.
Yes, that's a good one. And lowered hand washing stations for wheelchair access. That's also a great idea. Some of the other examples that we offer to partners are benches. We also have the sensory rooms, universal changing stations, as you guys mentioned, and ensuring drinking fountains and shade are available.
Brianna, those are some great examples. The next accessibility feature is accessible parking, which is an example of the priority area navigation. Accessible parking is one way to provide members of the community with disabilities increased access to goods, services, and programs. Accessible parking includes signage, dimensions, and number of spaces. It also considers guidelines for van accessible parking spaces. What are some other examples of accessibility features that support navigation? Please enter any ideas in the chat.
Let's see, somebody says wave entry doors and charging stations. We've also got curb cuts. Those are all great examples.
Those are great examples. I also see a wheelchair ramp.
Another good one. And we have text, raised characters and audio descriptions, curb ramps that don't fill with water, directional signage with icons, raised sidewalks.
These are great. Some other accessibility practices that we've offered are motorized wheelchair and scooter charging stations and temporary accessible pathways. Thank you so much for your responses.
Thank you for all of those ideas. Our next accessibility feature is tactile graphics, which is an example of the priority area experience. Tactile graphics turn non-textual information, such as an exhibit, piece of art, or a map into a tactile representation for individuals who are blind or who have low vision. Tactile graphics can accompany braille and audio descriptions to convey the information. What are some other examples of accessibility features that support experience?
Okay, we have sensory rooms as a suggestion. Great, as well as topographic maps for interaction, sensory-friendly hours for shopping, art museums with tactile opportunities, audible announcements on elevators, descriptions of scenery at parks, live captioning. These are great.
These are all great examples, and thank you everyone for giving them to us. We also have private waiting areas. Some of the additional ones that we can think of are assistive listening devices and systems, providing captioning, interpretation services, and audio descriptions.
Brianna, these are all great examples of accessibility features that support a person's experience. Our next accessibility feature is website accessibility, which is an example of the priority area planning and awareness. Website accessibility can include screen reader compatibility, the use of alternative or alt text, and the overall design of the website. Website accessibility greatly influences how an individual obtains information about an entity to plan a visit there. It can provide information related to the accessibility features available at a venue and offer instructions on how to request a reasonable accommodation when visiting. What are some other examples of accessibility features that support the planning and awareness priority?
Let's see here. We have Braille signage and audio versions, which might be an example from our experience priority. Larger font sizes, icons with descriptions.
Yes, thank you so much for those suggestions. We've also, some other strategies that we've thought of were accessibility maps, social narratives, which are those stories that can help individuals prepare for when they're visiting a venue, as well as disability etiquette and awareness training.
Julia, those are wonderful examples. Now let's talk about an accessibility feature that applies to all 4 priorities: alternative forms of communication. To increase access to communications and interacting in the community, it is best practice to provide multiple forms of communication. For example, a museum could provide a written and audio description of an exhibit. Also, a movie theater could provide assistive listening devices and captioning for performances. A parking garage at a mall could utilize red and green colored lights to indicate where parking spots are available and are taken, along with written information or symbols that convey the same meaning. Lastly, a stadium could use images and symbols in addition to the word restroom to communicate the location of a restroom.
Brianna, I think it's a good time to stop to answer any questions before we wrap up today's webinar. As a reminder, please submit a question using the chat or by raising your virtual hand.
Great idea. And there was a few more pre-submitted questions that we would like to answer first before we get into the chat. And somebody asked how to confront heavy doors one can't open in public and commercial spaces. So this is a great question. If we were consulting with an organization whose goal was to make their doors in public spaces more accessible, we would ask them questions to better understand their goal. We may visit their location to observe their environment, and then we would do research to gather resources and best practices to support their goal. This would likely include the accessibility guidelines from the ADA that address components of doors, such as how much physical effort it takes to open the door and the type of door hardware included. And we would include ideas from universal design for them to consider, like automatic door openers. Providing these resources to the organization will help them be more informed when making their decision on how to move forward with their goals. Julia, do you have another pre-submitted question you'd like to answer?
I do. The other pre-submitted question is, I have accessibility goals for my business. Can Accessible Ohio help me pay for the accessibility enhancements I would like to make? It's another great question. Here's how we can help. When we talk with an organization who is inquiring about funding, we can ask questions to better understand their goals and then do some research to identify grants and funding sources that may be a good fit for them. The partner can then determine whether these are funding sources they wish to pursue.
Thanks, Julia. I see that we do have quite a few questions that we didn't get to answer from the first chat. So let's see. Somebody asked, my organization has started to install AAC panels at our playgrounds, and they are considering the development of these panels for their facilities as well. And they ask, would your signage guide address this? Thank you for your question. We would love to talk to you one-on-one to better understand your goals. So then we could create a consult for you to connect you with those resources that can answer your questions, because it is on a case-by-case basis because every situation is unique. Julie, did you have anything to add to that one?
Sure. Hi, everybody. This is Julie Wood. And for that one, I would just add, this is an alternative communication board. And so when we do speak with entities about best practices, we do share alternative methods for communication. So as Brianna mentioned, it is case by case, but certainly that is something that we would consider if that is something that would apply to that environment. So thank you for sharing. That's a great idea.
And it looks like there's another question in the chat, which is, are private colleges, universities beholden to the same titles as public colleges, universities under the ADA? And so the Department of Justice is who enforces the Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA. And so if there are any specific questions in regards to a university, we would be happy to have an individual consult to help provide resources to help better answer questions.
And just to add to that, from a general perspective, Title II applies to state and local government, so that would likely apply to the public colleges and universities. And then Title III applies to private sector. And so for those private colleges would likely apply, but it's always best to check the guidance to make sure how it applies to each unique entity. And so each entity knows their specific responsibilities under the titles of the ADA.
Thanks, Julia and Julie. Let's see, I'm trying to sift through the chat here. Somebody says that they were at a meeting and it was mentioned that many people who are deaf do not use English as the primary language, and suggested that we take this into consideration when using universal design and have links to or signage with American Sign Language, since just providing written information is not very inclusive. And they ask, what are our thoughts about this and how can they assure they're being inclusive for people in the deaf community? Thank you for that question. I will say that that is an inclusive practice, and a best practice is to also include the individual with a disability when making those decisions. So it is a best practice to ask the individual what they need, and then you can implement it that way. Let's see, anything else to add for you two, or any other questions you see?
I would just add that anytime you're looking at communications or signage, that you think of alternative methods. So think about the written format, the audio format, the tactile format, and as Brianna mentioned, getting suggestions and information from the disability community can also help to inform the efforts that you want to make specific to your environment moving forward. And through a consult, we could talk through these specific types of questions and support with resources and best practices to help the entity make that decision.
I see another comment in the chat saying public school buildings, curb cuts, who could we reach out to? And so just wanted to share that the spirit of Accessible Ohio is to partner with businesses that would like to take steps forward on their accessibility journey. And so if this were a public school building that had interest in looking into accessibility enhancements, we would be more than happy to set up a consultation. Julie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, but I do see a question above in the chat about asking if Accessible Ohio applies to people with mental illnesses, and if so, how would it relate to employment? So I can go ahead and take that one. When we are consulting with entities and looking through the best practices and the resources that we're providing in that consultation, we consider all disability types, all disability groups in those best practices that we share. So Accessible Ohio considers all disability types when providing the services in the various ways that we do. And the way that we provide services to employers is the way that we always have. Accessible Ohio is an initiative that is starting this year and allows us to transcend employment to the public environment to provide accessibility consultations and best practices. But we will continue to also support employers with their responsibilities under Title I. So projects such as thinking about an accessible hiring page, consulting on the reasonable accommodation process, sharing ways to create a disability inclusive workplace, and also just sharing ideas for what could be possible reasonable accommodations specific to that work environment. So we will continue to support employers through Accessible Ohio, as well as now these new spaces that we can go to in the public environment.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for catching that in the chat.
Sure.
To respect everyone's time, we are going to conclude today's webinar, but we will stay a few minutes after this presentation to address the questions that we did not have time to answer. If you need to leave, no worries. This will be archived with the rest of the presentation and posted on the employer page of the OOD website with the remaining webinars in our on-demand library. Through today's webinar, we are excited to introduce you to the Accessible Ohio initiative and how it can be a resource for Ohio's businesses, communities, venues, attractions, and employers in creating environments that are accessible and inclusive for everyone. These services we offer through Accessible Ohio include individualized consultations, educational offerings, and helpful resource guides. To help our partners prioritize where to start and what step to take next in their accessibility journey, we have organized our efforts according to the fundamentals we shared today. These include the 4 Accessible Ohio priorities, the guidelines provided by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the concept of universal design. When we prioritize accessibility and promote inclusiveness, we take steps towards making sure everyone can experience and participate in the activities and services that are meaningful and important to them. Our Accessible Ohio specialists are available to meet with entities to listen to their needs, provide resources, and engage in an ongoing partnership as we work together toward our mission to empower everyone to experience all our great state has to offer in an equitable way. To get started, please contact the Accessible Ohio specialist in your region. Our contact information is on our webpage. Thank you all for joining us today. I also want to thank Julia. I've enjoyed presenting with you today, and we certainly appreciate the awesome webinar team who work hard to make these webinars a success.